On the 29th of August, 1828, a disaster that has since been forgotten happened just behind me in Tarbet on Loch Lomond. What was supposed to be a lovely trip on a ferry called the Lady of the Lake turned into something out of a nightmare. And this, far more than any of the other tragedies I've covered, has very, very little information about it. There are only a couple of reports to go on. This might be brief.
And make sure you stick around to the end of the video for a fascinating interview with the local historian who first brought this story to my attention. And now that he's kickstarted efforts to help share this story, he wants to take things one step further, and you might be able to help him with that.
This is the tragedy of the Lady of the Lake.
First, a little history about steamers on Loch Lomond. And for this, we have to go all the way back to 1818. So only 10 years before this story we're about to speak about. And in 1818, the idea of steamers or ferries on Loch Lomond was still relatively new. And a pioneering engineer named David Napier had a small steamboat built for himself. He named it Marion after his wife, and then spent the next year or so taking it up and down the Clyde, for which it became very well known. Around the same time, thanks to novels like Rob Roy, the tourist trade around Loch Lomond was really starting to grow. And this is where Napier landed on an idea. Why not take the Marion from the Clyde up to Loch Lomond and provide an incredible experience for tourists crossing the loch on his steamboat? All in all, it took about 10 hours to circumnavigate the whole loch, and being an early steamboat was rather loud. And there were some interesting opinions on this new tourist attraction. In August 1818, one Lord Geoffrey described the experience of seeing it like this.
It was certainly strange and striking to hear and see it hissing and roaring past the headlands of our little bay, foaming and shouting like an angry whale. But on the whole, it rather vulgarizes the scene too much.
So the Marion continued chugging away until about 1825. When a group of local businessmen got together and formed the Loch Lomond Steamboat Company, and they brought out a rival steamer called the Lady of the Lake. They charged cheaper fares than the Marion, which was charging about 7 shillings and sixpence, to the Lady of the Lake's 3 shillings, and so a bit of local friendly competition ensued. And this competition came to a head in 1828 after Napier replaced the Marion with a larger steamer, and the Lady of the Lake was offered up for sale. And before making her way to the River Clyde, she was involved in one last fateful incident on Loch Lomond.
I was going to get the drone out and get some incredible shots of Loch Lomond. I mean, it still looks cool, but would look cooler with a drone. Again, as always, coming out to film these stories and actually coming to the locations they happened in, it's always a sobering reminder that most people who come here to visit have no idea, which makes sense. It was, nigh on almost 200 years ago, which sounds insane when you say it out loud. But these were still people. These were still people with friends and families who lost their lives when they should have been having a lovely trip out on the loch, and that's not how it ended.
By all accounts, it was an incredibly nice day, and the waters of Loch Lomond were calm and still. A perfect day for a trip round the loch on the steamer. Many people looking forward to this trip had gathered at Tarbet, and a small boat was loading passengers to be taken out to the Lady of the Lake, who was sitting further out in the loch. It seems as though around 20 passengers had piled into this small boat, which once everybody had squeezed themselves on board, and this was a very small boat, so there was not a lot of room here, the boat started making its way out to the lady. And here we have one of the few reports of what happened next.
About 2:00 p.m, the Lady of the Lake steamboat was lying off Tarbet on her return to Bullock for the purpose of taking in passengers who were to be rowed alongside of her in a small boat. The boat put off from the shore with upwards of 20 passengers, and had reached the steamer when, by some untoward accident, not yet properly accounted for, but supposed to be caused by the people making a sudden rush towards one side, the boat was upset, and the whole of the passengers thrown into the water.
Apparently, according to the eyewitnesses who did actually see it happen, something caused a sudden rush. Every passenger on board rushed suddenly to one side of the boat and the whole thing capsized in an instant. As little as we have to go on about the actual tragedy, what is fascinating to me, especially being here right now, and obviously the weather's not great, there's not a lot of people out and about at the moment, it's very quiet and peaceful, and apparently not a lot was heard. It basically seemed as though the boat capsized so quickly that people barely had a chance to scream before they were under and in the water. And so for those on land watching, if they hadn't seen it happen, they might have had no idea what had occurred.
So unlooked for was this occurrence that the people were overwhelmed before they were aware of their danger, and scarcely a cry was uttered. So effectually and so suddenly did the waters check the cry of despair which rose to the lips of the sufferers. The boat was not more than 30 or 40 yards from the shore. A small boat belonging to the Lady of the Lake was lowered immediately by the people on board, who succeeded in picking up several of them. A number saved themselves by swimming, and an individual is said to have swam ashore with no fewer than 3 holding by the skirts of his coat. 2 females who witnessed the catastrophe, with a heroism and promptitude which does them honour, rowed a boat to the spot, and drew several of the struggling sufferers on board. One of the women, in the absence of an oar, laid hold of a stick, with which she rowed the boat, while the other assisted with her hand. One man saved 5 people with his exertions. 1 or 2 persons rushed into the water in the hopes of extending assistance, but were obliged to return unsuccessful. Everything that circumstances would admit of was done to save the lives of the sufferers. But in spite of the most arduous exertions, the waters prevailed. Indeed, it is believed that some of them never again reached the surface after the upsetting of the boat.
Now, apparently, when the capsizing occurred, basically it must have been literally here. Apparently the boat was about 30 or 40 yards out from the shore, and that's not very far. But actually, when you're stood here, if you were to see, let's say about where those boys are behind me, you can just about see them there where I'm pointing, you would see a boat capsized there. By the time, let's say, you were brave enough to jump in the water or get in a rowboat and get out there, by the time you've made it out there, as close as it is, that is more than enough time for people to drown. I remember reading something incredibly harrowing once, that all it really takes to drown is a couple of accidental deep breaths underwater, and that could be it.
We also have an extract from a letter written by a Reverend Proudfoot, who provided some more detail on what had happened and the victims of this disaster. Andrew McFarlane, a wright in Tarbet who left a widow and 3 children to lament his loss. Mrs. Harvey, a widow from Glasgow, whose son was also caught in the water with her but managed to escape. Those were who were identified sooner. Along with them were several people who could only be identified by their clothing. Reverend Proudfoot also painted a despairing picture of the scene after it happened.
One feeling, that of intense sympathy, was felt and powerfully exhibited by all who were either employed in recovering the bodies from the watery grave, in carrying them to the inn, or employing every means to reanimate which skill or compassion could suggest. All, alas, was in vain. The world, with all its magnificent and beauteous scenery, upon which their eyes had but lately gazed, had fled. In the twinkling of an eye, all the mighty realities of eternity were unveiled.
As the Reverend Proudfoot touched upon there, the bodies of those who could not be revived were moved to the Tarbet Inn, which became something of a makeshift mortuary. And over time, after the victims were identified, the bodies began to be transported back home to be properly laid to rest. Some of the victims that Reverend Proudfoot mentioned were later identified. One gentleman was identified as a young Englishman around 20 years of age, who had been with his wife at the time, who had also perished. A few days later, the Reverend updated his account, as more witnesses who had been at the scene came forward with their own accounts.
The beautiful lake at the moment of the calamity was as smooth as glass, but the boat left the shore in such a crowded state, and in such a sort of delicate equilibrium, that the slightest motion either to one side or the other was sufficient to overturn the puny cobble. And, in point of fact, this equilibrium was actually destroyed by 2 or 3 people standing up at once, anxious to get into a place of safety, which circumstance was the immediate cause of so great a loss of life, and the occasion of so much grief and loss to surviving relations and friends.
He also goes on to make a note of how perhaps the rush to squeeze as many tourists aboard as possible, to squeeze every last penny out of them, was one of the reasons the boat was so overloaded, and suggested that certain regulations should be adopted and strictly adhered to when it comes to the delivery of and the behaviour of passengers aboard. He also makes sure to note that the crew of the Lady of the Lake acted with honour, and apparently, as soon as it became clear that the boat had capsized, immediately did everything in their power to try and save the lives of the drowning. In fact, apparently it had been clear to them as the boat was making its way across that it was in serious danger, and the small boat had actually slowed down somewhat on its way to the Lady of the Lake because of the protestations of the crew aboard. It's just so unfortunate that at what sounds like the very last moment, it couldn't make it. As far as we can make out from the reports and personal accounts that we do have, 11 of the 20 people aboard the small boat were lost.
Another tragic part of this, again, probably, a factor of it being such a long time ago and such a little known tragedy, is that there is also no memorial to go and visit. There are no graves that we know of to go and see for the 11 victims of this tragedy. And I know that a couple of years ago, there was actually a campaign launched by a local firefighter who was essentially fed up with people drowning on the loch and not, paying attention to the dangers that were here, and thought that, well, there's this little known tragedy that happened on the loch, and maybe we can raise some awareness by commemorating this. So he launched a campaign a couple of years ago to get a plaque remembering this tragedy.
And that man's name is Jamie MacTavish, and I had the honour of joining him on a Zoom call to talk not just about this awful tragedy, but the wonderful plan he has to try and make sure it's never forgotten.
Jamie, thank you for joining me on this call. I think this is something new for the channel. We've not really interviewed anybody before, so this is going to be a bit of an experiment. So thanks for jumping on board with me for this. So first things first, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your own background?
My name's Jamie MacTavish. I'm born and bred in the village. My mother was born in the same house that I still live in. My great-grandfather was the first doctor in the village. So I have a few generations in this village. We've always been involved in community stuff, and I was one of the founder members, along with my mother, of the local heritage group, who have been recording local history. We've got a website that's won awards, and we've been approached. I was approached by a museum in Glasgow to give information. The £16 million Riverside Museum got me as a contributor. So yes, I've been involved in local projects and local history and making sure that it's accurately recorded rather than misinterpreted or word of mouth changes it slightly.
Perfect. And I mean, that makes sense, because I think in the article that I found you in first about this particular tragedy, I remember you saying that you most likely had ancestors who were in the area at the time it happened.
Yes, yeah, I would have, yes.
Which is incredible. And it goes to show as well, it's something that I keep repeating over and over again in videos, is how it doesn't matter how long ago these things happened, we can still feel the impact, even if we're not 100% aware of it at the time. Like families, generations later, can still feel the impact of these things. Doesn't matter how long it's been. So that it's incredible that you're so, I suppose, well connected to the area and this story as well. So how was it that you actually first came to hear of this particular tragedy?
My mum had told me growing up, she had heard of a tragedy at Tarbet that her father had told her about, and obviously, his father before him. there had been loose information going through the village that there had been a tragedy at Tarbet, but like modern tragedies, I think some people would try to forget it. Some people had tried to ignore it, and they didn't want to rake it up or look into things that might cause hurt or upset sort of bereaved families coming across information and things. So a lot of it was forgotten. But the feature on the internet that everyone finds with the old newspaper cutting, I read that and thought, surely there should be some mark to mark those lives that were lost. And in such a popular spot, Tarbet Pier is so popular with boaters, and there's so much activity. They've recently spent hundreds of thousands doing the area up right at Tarbet Pier. The area where it happened was just between Tarbet Pier and the local primary school. So even the primary school was interested. They said they had no idea. There's a lot of families, obviously, that don't have the same local connections I've got. So yeah, I read it online, and my mum said, "Oh yeah, that was spoken about," but I think we got more details from that newspaper article than anyone could actually remember. There wasn't anything on the heritage group at the time on the website.
It's interesting as well, because obviously when it's a story that's passed down through generations and generations, it's like Chinese whispers. These things can get kind of like muddled, and the details can get lost. And I know my wife is a historian, and she always talks about it's sometimes the same thing with articles and newspaper cuttings and things like that as well. People either kind of can sometimes hear that story before they write an article itself, and so they might hear a different story from someone who witnessed it, and that could get muddled there. So even the written recordings can't necessarily be 100% kind of trusted for their accuracy, and it's always a case of like, really ultimately with this stuff, you just don't, unless you were there. It's always impossible to get the full picture of what actually happened at the time. But like you say, those newspaper cuttings that do exist, they do still paint quite some of the descriptions of the aftermath are quite vivid, aren't they? I remember there's that report written by was it Reverend Proudfoot?
Yes.
Who had quite a vivid way of explaining kind of how people acted at the time and what happened afterwards. I'm assuming from what he'd heard from people who were there as well. But yeah, it's incredible that this stuff, like, we only have these tiny little snippets of it, and yet 11 people lost their lives. And so you're right in saying that there should be more, shouldn't there? There should be something to commemorate the fact that 11 people were lost, and who knows how many families and friends were affected by this. So I suppose the next logical place to go to would be, I found your article talking about this in 2023. It's now 2025. So what's the update on the situation? Has much progress been made?
They've spent a lot of money on the area. They've spent hundreds of thousands re-landscaping and overnight parking for motorhomes and things. And the people involved in that, like the Development Trust, they've all said they would be very welcoming to supporting May in any way they could and getting permission for whatever we want to put up. And they all feel that it's very much forgotten and it should be remembered. We should try, even if it's a plaque on a tree, just to get some permanent marker to remember those people and remember the bravery of some that went in to try to save people and rescue people that were scared of the water were going into the water to try and save others.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you said earlier about how kind of busy that area can get, especially now with tourists and people coming down to the pier. Do you think it's important as well, not just as a memorial to the people that were lost almost 200 years ago, but do you think it's an important reminder to people who are going there today about the potential dangers that still exist?
Very much so. There's a lot of accidents in Loch Lomond. There's people falling out of boats. There's people that drive from Glasgow Airport, Edinburgh Airport, drive from the south of England. They're overwarm, get out of a car, decide, that looks quite tempting, I'll go in and cool down, go into the loch, and sort of thermal shock and the heart attacks, and there's a lot of people still kill themselves in Loch Lomond just jumping in and not realizing how dangerous it is so close to the shore.
And I saw that you have your experience in the fire service, and so I imagine you have quite a lot of personal experience of this and in going down to help out. Is that true?
Yes, that is. Yeah, there's a surprising number of water rescues. We're only sort of very basic water rescue training, but there's two rescue boats operate on Loch Lomond because the number of people that end up in trouble. We've got throw lines and hose inflation kits and things. We can get to people that are close to the shore, but it's amazing. Whole families go in, and there's tragedies still.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? I think even from the short amount of time that I've been looking into these kinds of stories, and I've covered lots of, boats sinking and tragedies at sea and in the water. And I think, do you think it's a case that people might look at the ocean and think, oh, well, it's the sea. I know that's dangerous. But they look at Loch Lomond and see how, even when I was there the other day, the weather wasn't amazing, but it was still perfectly calm. The water looked very still. Do you think people underestimate that?
They do, yeah, because they think they're walking across the sand and they imagine the slope carries on the same in the water, but it falls away. There's shelves and there's deeper sections quite close to the shore where people suddenly go out of their depth and suddenly end up very cold or taking a big gulp of water and ending up in trouble.
And that's something that I remember from one of the other things that I covered is how quickly you can be, in big trouble. I mean, and you think of the shock of, and especially with this tragedy where it sounds like they were in the water before they knew what was happening, that it's all it takes is a couple of accidental deep breaths underwater and you filled your lungs and you're in a very, very bad way. So I can imagine it's incredibly dangerous. So hopefully, something like this would also not just remind us of what happened in the past, but how people should still kind of be more aware of their surroundings maybe today.
It's an area that doesn't have a lot of warning signs. Down at Balloch, at the bottom end of Loch Lomond, there are warning signs about how treacherous the water can be and to be careful entering the water and how cold it would be. But the Tarbet area doesn't have a lot of warning. Firkin and Tarbet don't have a lot of warning about people swimming in the loch and going in on paddle boards and things, and if they fall in, they get a shock at how cold it is and how quickly it affects them.
And well, hopefully that could be another little, assuming that hopefully we get to the point where something can be installed there. Maybe that's another kind of little stepping stone further along, is like, oh well, maybe this could encourage them to install some more safety signage as well.
Yes, yeah, a reminder to everyone.
Yeah,
how dangerous it actually is there.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. So, what's the best way you think that anyone who's watching this who might have been, touched by the story of what happened, or just kind of feels like this is important? Because I think this is important, and it would be nice to see some physical, tangible action happening on the back of this. What's the best way that people can actually kind of support you?
Well, if people could contact me if they've got any good ideas, if they've got if they're artistic, if they could design a memorial. My approach when I was contacting sculptors was, I was thinking of being in the fire and rescue service. I thought that you get the little statue saved with the man carrying a child.
Yeah.
But if we could get a similar one, I said someone wearing clothes from the early 1800s and carrying someone that was soaked and affected by being immersed in freezing water. I thought maybe a 300mm statue on top of a stone cairn wouldn't look out of place. Maybe a brass plaque and have it at the side of Loch Lomond as a reminder of the people that were lost there, but as a reminder of water safety as well and how dangerous it is.
Yeah, that would be incredible, because I think if we could get that statue, that would be awesome, because that's something that's going to catch people's eye and they will probably be more interested to go over and see what it's about. Because I think sometimes you see where a plaque is good, but sometimes I think you can kind of look over or glance over a plaque Whereas that, it sounds
Yes.
like something where that's good. That's already kind of telling a story in and of itself, isn't it?
Tarbet Pier is so popular. If anyone's ever seen the film The Last King of Scotland,
Yeah.
the Idi Amin film, one of the early scenes in that involves them jumping off Tarbet Pier. You know, it's been in a lot of films. It's been in a lot of tourist brochures, but there just isn't the water safety information there should be around that area.
It's so important, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I'll put your contact details in the description. Yeah, and then hopefully lots of people can reach out. Lots of generous people can reach out and see if we can make something happen. Because, like you said, the 200th anniversary is in 2028, so we've still got 3 years to make something happen, which should be more than enough time. I know it's been 2 years already, but hopefully we can kick things on with this.
No, that would be great. That would be wonderful. It's, as I say, I've got support on the ground from MSPs, from councillors. Everyone thinks it's a nice idea, but it's just getting things started. If anyone knows a sculptor that would be willing to design something, even to give us some basic ideas of what they could do, that would be wonderful as well.
Yeah, that would be incredible. We have to do a follow-up video where we come and film the installation of the memorial. That would be amazing.
We thought if we could get, like some descendant of some survivor to unveil it, that would be wonderful. There was a local woman who thought she was managing to track down the descendant of one survivor, but she's still not sure.
That would be incredible. Well, 3 years, anything can happen in 3 years. Maybe there's a descendant of a survivor out there who might end up watching this video. So you never know. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, the more information we get out there, the better.
So is there anything else you wanted to say about this particular tragedy, or what you've been trying to do, or actually talk a little bit about the Heritage Society that you founded?
The Aricur Tarbet Heritage. We got some awards for the website. It seems a bit morbid, but I was the photographer, so I photographed every gravestone in the Aricur graveyard. It was the world's first complete online graveyard, so it's not a big graveyard.
Incredible.
The one in Tarbet would be the one where local bodies from the boat tragedy would have been buried. It's a very old graveyard, a very interesting graveyard, just next to the Kirk of the Lochs, just at Ballyhennan.
That's incredible. I'm gonna have to go there next time I'm up.
Yes, yeah. I can walk around with you. I've got details of interesting gravestones there.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. And I know, having been in a lot of cemeteries, especially since having been doing this, that with things that are this old, it's so difficult to find those graves sometimes. I've been to so many where everything is completely overgrown, and even when you can find a headstone or something, it's so badly disfigured that you just can't make out what it was. But that's incredible, because I know there's a lot of people that use services like Find a Grave or things like that. So having one completely fully documented graveyard is fantastic, and I think that's a job that I would happily do.
Yes, we did it in springtime. There was some nice flowers, and some people wrote biographies. There was other people. Other people from Australia and New Zealand said, I had no idea my great-grandmother's grave was in such a state. Do you know anyone that cleans gravestones? So it did get publicity as well.
That's incredible. Well, thank you for joining me for this, Jamie. Hopefully we can get the message out there, and hopefully we can make some more progress, and hopefully we'll have an update for people in not too long.
That's great. Thank you for your help.
Once again, thank you to Jamie for joining me for that chat. I think it's incredibly important to get the local perspective, and he obviously has an incredibly important reason for wanting this story to be more widely known and remembered. So if you think you might be able to help, I've popped his contact details in the description below.
I think it's a fantastic idea, and again, it's another reason why we try and remember these tragic events, even if they were 200 years ago, because they can still teach us lessons today about dangers that could be all around us. And I know a lot's changed health and safety wise since 1828, but lochs and huge bodies of water like this still remain a huge risk to people going in and on them. So thank you for watching this one. Bit of a weird one, not a crazy amount to get into, but I still think an important lesson, and again an important tragedy to remember. And I think the campaign to try and get a plaque commemorating this or memorialising this here is a very, very good idea. So hopefully some progress can be made on that. And as usual, I will see you in the next one.